Welcome, folks. Today we will discuss three foundational myths around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that dominate the Western discourse. Myth 1. That Palestine was a land without people, given to a people without a land. Myth 2. That the Palestinians are inherently unreasonable and stubborn people who have rejected all peace proposals. Myth 3. That the Nakba, or expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, was a mere collateral damage from the 1948 war. The uncritical acceptance of these myths in the world's power centers has had disastrous consequences on the region, including proposals for patently unrealistic and unjust solutions that are far removed from the reality of the problems at hand. So today let's look at all three of these myths one by one, starting with the first myth. Israel was pitched to Western power centers as a land without people, for a people without a land. A just and logical solution to both the centuries-long persecution of Jewish people as well as lack of so-called development in the supposedly desolate landscape of Palestine. This belief still persists till today. Photographs like this one from Tel Aviv of the 1930s are shown to us as evidence that what we know today to be the thriving urban centers of Israel were once just pieces of empty land. The only problem is, if the photographer had turned the camera around a bit, they would have seen these. The bustling Arab-majority port city of Jaffa. Not just inhabited with tens of thousands of people but with all amenities of urban life, historical landmarks and its own distinct culture. In fact, close to 1 million people lived all over Palestine in different cities, towns and villages, nearly 500 of which were wiped out during the 1948 war. But more on that later. Israel Zangwill, a close compatriot of Theodore Herzl who is most widely associated with the land without people slogan after he echoed it in 1901, just a few years later realized how grossly wrong it was. He renounced not only the slogan but the idea of Zionism itself, saying in 1904 that Palestine proper already has its inhabitants. The Pashalik of Jerusalem is already twice as thickly populated as the United States. Unfortunately, while Zangwill changed his ways, many other Zionist leaders did not. Unlike Zangwill, whose belief in the myth of land without a people formed because he actually thought the land was uninhabited, many other prominent Zionists believed in this myth with a much more sinister twist. For them, it wasn't that the land without people was uninhabited. It was the fact that they literally did not believe the inhabitants of the land to be people in the same sense as themselves. Early Zionist literature is filled with dehumanizing and degrading references to the indigenous Palestinians. They are referred to as barbarians, lazy, and uncivilized. Perhaps the most jarring of these views was also held by the most powerful man at the time. Winston Churchill, who likened the Palestinians to a dog in the manger, said he believes no wrong is done to them if they get replaced by a superior race. So the myth of Palestine being a land without people was rooted in both the misinformation about the demographic makeup of the place and also in dehumanization of those who lived there. The second myth is that the main culprits of this conflict are the stubborn Arabs who rejected all the generous peace proposals from the Peel Commission Plan of 1936 and UN Partition Plan of 1948 to Camp David and Taba proposals in early 2000s. There are twofold problems with this myth. First, it says Arabs rejected these solutions, without actually explaining what it was in those plans that the Arabs objected to. For example, we are told that the Arabs outright rejected the Peel Commission Plan, which was the first official two-state proposal. But we are rarely ever told that the proposal allotted the majority of the coastline to the Jewish state, along with most of the farmable land and major financial centers like Haifa and Jaffa. But even more importantly, the plan wouldn't just place the Arabs living in those towns under a new Jewish government. It literally proposed their compulsory expulsion from their home cities to other parts of the Middle East. To this day, Palestinians are demonized for opposing a plan that proposed their own ethnic cleansing. Similarly, while we are often told that Israel tried to negotiate a peaceful independence of Palestinians at Camp David and Taba Conference, it is often left out that the so-called Palestinian state offered by Israel was a collection of disjointed islands of Palestinian sovereignty surrounded by Israeli-controlled regions. Moreover, Israel would control the airspace, border crossings, water distribution, and even foreign policy of the proposed Palestinian state. Essentially, What Israel offered to Palestinians at Camp David and Taba was not a fully independent sovereign state, but a few limited autonomy zones similar to South African Bantustans. Second problem with the myth of Arab stubbornness is that they weren't the only ones to reject many of the proposals. Early leaders on the Israeli side also did not find the two-state solution acceptable. For example, while the Arabs are often singled out for rejecting the Peel Commission proposal, it must be noted that the 20th Zionist Congress in Zurich also rejected it in a near-unanimous vote, arguing that areas allocated to the Jewish state were too small. Even when they did agree to partition, most of the mainstream leaders did so only on an ad hoc basis to gain an initial foothold in the region. For example, David Ben-Gurion, soon to be the first Prime Minister of Israel, had this to say about the partition: "I am satisfied with part of the country, but on the basis of the assumption that after we build up a strong force following the establishment of the state, we will abolish the partition of the country and we will expand to the whole land of Israel." In letters to his family, Ben-Gurion wrote, "I don't regard a state in part of Palestine as the final aim of Zionism, but as a means toward that aim." Similarly, Israeli historian Simcha Flappen notes in his book that Chaim Weizmann, who later became president of Israel, initially believed that the partition of Palestine would only be a 20 to 30-year arrangement, after which Israel would expand into the rest of the territory. Final point to state here before we conclude busting the myth of Arab stubbornness is that, ironically, David Ben-Gurion was far more understanding of the Palestinian perspective than most modern commentators on the conflict are. In private conversations with Nahum Goldman, the founder of World Jewish Congress, Ben-Gurion is reported to have said, "If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, but 2,000 years ago, and what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism in Europe, but was that their fault? They only see one thing: we have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that?" The third and perhaps most consequential myth is the denial of Nakba. By refusing to accept the reality of Nakba, or the forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes, pro-Israel narrative builders hope to deny the displaced refugees their right to return home, and absolve Israel of its responsibility to pay reparations to them or return their confiscated properties. In pursuit of this end, they attempt to paint the removal of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes as a spontaneous result of the 1948 war. Some go even further than that, and claim those people voluntarily left their villages to make room for the Arab armies that were coming to fight against Israel. All of these claims are belied by a 50-years-long paper trail that preceded the Nakba. For example, in 1895, Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, proposed expulsion of Palestinians through the means of employment discrimination. One of his diary entries read, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. Expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." The next generation of Zionist leaders was much more willing to use force. In June 1938, Ben-Gurion told a meeting of the Jewish Agency, "I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it. The plan de let, the blueprint of establishing Israeli sovereignty in the newly created state, called for the quote-unquote destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines in the debris, especially those population centers which are difficult to control continuously. It also called for expulsion of entire populations from any villages where any resistance is encountered." Ultimately, over 500 villages and towns were razed to ground as part of this plan. With that said, it is clear that the Nakba was not an unintended consequence of sporadic violence during a war, but a well-planned and executed expulsion. This concludes the inaugural video of our Palestine series, refuting 3 of the common myths around the discourse. If you liked this video, share it with someone you believe can learn from it. We will be back with more explainers.